The forest was not supposed to be this dark. Evan had camped plenty of times before, state parks, riverbanks, even an old quarry once, but nothing had ever felt like this. The pines here seemed to lean closer with every step, their branches like skeletal arms blotting out the moonlight. His flashlight barely cut a thin tunnel through the blackness, and the beam kept catching on shapes that looked far too much like people standing just beyond reach. He told himself it was only trees. It had to be. The air was colder than he expected, damp with the smell of wet leaves and soil. Somewhere far off, an owl called, but the sound felt muted, like it had to fight its way through the thick silence that pressed down on everything. He shifted his pack nervously, adjusting the strap on his shoulder, as if the added weight could somehow ground him in a place that felt unreal. Blue Loop Trail, 3 miles, he muttered to himself, repeating the marker he'd seen at the start. I just need to circle back, easy. He repeated it like a mantra, as though saying it enough times would make it true. But the more he walked, the less convinced he became. The trail marker was gone. He was certain there had been one nailed to a post when he started. Blue Loop, 3.2 miles. Now there was only empty bark where the wood should have been. He blinked at the tree, running his hand across the rough surface. Splinters caught his skin, but there was no sign that anything had ever been nailed there. No holes, no scars in the bark. It was as though he had imagined it. He frowned. Maybe he'd taken a wrong turn. Maybe he was off the loop entirely. But he had been careful, hadn't he? He always was. His friends teased him about being overly cautious, the kind of guy who brought extra batteries, who triple-checked maps, who packed more water than anyone could possibly need. Getting lost wasn't supposed to happen to him. Behind him, the crunch of leaves. He froze. Hello? His voice wavered. It didn't carry far, as if the trees swallowed the sound whole. Is someone there? No reply. He waited longer than he should have before pushing forward, quicker this time, his boots scraping against roots and damp earth. The sound of footsteps matched him, just out of sync, like an echo with a heartbeat's delay. He tried to convince himself it was just the woods shifting, a branch falling, maybe a deer moving through the brush. But the footsteps were too measured, too human. Evan whipped around, flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam cut across trunks, shadows, branches, but nothing moved, nothing alive. The forest, however, was whispering. At first he thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze. The air was too still, too heavy. The whispers came from everywhere at once, low, overlapping voices, like a crowd speaking secrets. He couldn't make out words, but his name seemed to repeat between the static hush. Evan. His chest tightened. He wanted to shout, to scare away whoever or whatever it was, but his throat was too dry. Instead, he turned and ran. Branches whipped at his arms, tore at his jacket. The trail dipped and twisted, but no matter how far he sprinted, the whispers kept pace, sliding along the bark, pooling in the blackness, just beyond his light. He slowed eventually, chest heaving, lungs burning. He pressed a hand against a tree, rough bark scraping his palm, and tried to listen past the pounding in his ears. The whispers had stopped. The silence was worse. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. When he stumbled into the clearing, relief nearly dropped him to his knees. Open space, a break from the claustrophobic trees. He was breathing hard, sweat cooling on his skin. The clearing was wrong, though. In the middle stood a cabin, rotting wood, sagging roof, windows black as eyes. It hadn't been on any map. He would have sworn it hadn't existed a moment ago. His flashlight beam skittered across it, catching on warped planks and a chimney that leaned precariously to the side. Something about the sight felt staged, as though the forest had been leading him here, but the door was open just slightly and a warm light flickered from inside. Candlelight. Evan's instincts screamed at him to stay away, but logic tried to soothe him. Cabins meant people, people meant safety, shelter, maybe even someone with a phone who could help him find the trail. His body moved forward, even as his mind told him to stop. He had to believe there was a good reason for this. The closer he came, the stranger the forest became. The clearing was ringed by trees that all leaned inward as if trying to keep something in. Their bark was split, blackened, and when his flashlight grazed across them, he swore he saw patterns etched into the wood. Spirals, eyes, mouths. Some looked fresh, the grooves still raw and bleeding sap like open wounds. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination. The whispers urged him forward. The cabin's interior glowed warm, though the light seemed too bright for the handful of candles flickering inside. Their flames bent toward him as he stepped through the door, as if greeting him. He closed the door softly behind him, though the sound seemed to echo far too long in the still air. Inside, the air was warmer, but it smelled like damp earth and burnt wax. Shadows swayed unnaturally along the walls, stretching long, curling like fingers. The furniture was sparse, an old table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with dusty jars filled with things he didn't want to identify. Some looked like herbs, others looked like pieces. Small bones, tiny hands pressed against glass, eyes floating in murky liquid. On the table lay a book, leather cover, blackened edges, pulsing faintly like it had a heartbeat of its own. His name was written on the first page, not in ink, in something darker, something that glistened. The cabin door slammed shut. Evan spun, heart hammering, but the handle wouldn't budge. He rattled it desperately, the sound loud and metallic, but it was as though the wood had fused around the lock. The whispers roared into words. "We've been waiting, Evan." He dropped the flashlight. The beam spun across the floor, catching bare footprints, wet, muddy prints circling the room. Some fresh, some old. Too many. He wasn't alone. In the candlelight, shapes peeled themselves from the walls, tall, thin figures with no eyes, no faces, only mouths that stretched wide and smiled too much. Their limbs were too long, bending in ways bones shouldn't. As they stepped forward, their bodies creaked like timber straining under weight. The whispers came from them now, every voice overlapping, filling his head until thought was impossible. They stepped closer and closer still. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the table, but the book drew him in. Its pages fluttered until it stopped, revealing lines of text written in that same dark substance. His name appeared again, repeated over and over, each one larger than the last. His vision blurred. His body moved without him, hand lifting toward the page. His finger pressed down where his name waited, sealing it. The candle flames hissed, bending higher. The forest outside answered. Every tree groaned like something inside them was straining to be free. The pines shuddered, though there was no wind, their trunks splitting wider like rib cages cracking open. He could hear roots tearing free from the earth, the sound like screams muffled underground. The creatures reached him, their mouths opening wider, wider, until the cabin was nothing but blackness. He felt the heat of their breath, smelled decay and damp moss. Hands closed around him, cold, clammy, strong, and then silence. The forest swallowed him whole. But the story did not end with Evan. The woods never allowed endings, only cycles. 2 days later, hikers found his pack resting neatly at the trailhead. The zipper was pulled shut, the straps tucked carefully beneath it. His phone was gone, his flashlight too, but the pack looked almost placed, as though it had been returned, not dropped. No one could explain it. Locals whispered about the clearing. They said the cabin appeared for those who doubted themselves, who let fear creep in. A test or a trap, no one knew. But some swore they had seen a glow between the trees on moonless nights. Some swore they had heard voices calling names not their own. One old hunter claimed he had gone into the clearing once and turned back before stepping inside. He said the air pressed against his chest like a weight, that he could feel hands brushing his shoulders, though he saw nothing. He said the whispers promised him things, long life, strength, power, if only he signed his name. He ran instead, and he never hunted that part of the forest again. And still, the cabin waits. The next morning, the trail marker was back where it belonged. Blue Loop, 3.2 miles. Hikers passed it without noticing anything strange. A couple laughed, talking loudly to keep the silence at bay. They didn't notice how the air grew colder as they passed the clearing, or how the trees leaned just a little too close together, but deep in the woods the book lies open. And the whispers keep calling new names.